Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. It's Wednesday, October 23rd, 2024, and this week we're going to be answering 3 questions we've been hearing from international educators over the last 7 days. And as we do each week on the Roundup, we take our questions that we ask here on Wednesday afternoon from our newsletter that comes out on Mondays. And that newsletter is called All the SMIE News Fit to Share. And that includes stories related to social media implications, webinars, data reports, online, AI, anything that might impact international education. And also includes a significant roundup of both U.S. International education news, solutions, and we focus here on solutions here at SMIE Consulting, as well as a global roundup of what's happening in other major destination markets and how they are grappling with the issues of the day related to international education. So as we do each week on the roundup here, we cover themes we see developing in the newsletter on Mondays. We cover more in depth our questions that we answer here today related to those topics. So we are interested in first sharing with you the subscription link to our website, smieconsulting.org/subscribe, where you can subscribe to that newsletter if you prefer to get an email version of it. And I'll also drop the link to this week's edition into the chat so you can have that for your reference. And in terms of the other major way we like to get our news, and I know I like to get my news other than email subscriptions, is from LinkedIn. And if you do get your, prefer your international ed news from LinkedIn, we have a version of that available. And the LinkedIn version plus the email version of this newsletter have between them well over 2,200 subscribers. So very excited about what that means for our international education community around the world, majority in the US, but those that see the value in the content that we're putting out in the newsletter, and then here again on the Roundup, our podcast version, audio-only podcast version of the Midweek Roundup has been downloaded over almost 4,000 times. So we're very excited about the breadth and the reach of our content that we deliver weekly free of charge to our international education peers around the country and indeed the world. So if you are ready to go, we'll jump right into the first question of the week, and that is it now the rule that we must diversify or die when it comes to international student recruitment? And this is coming out of a webinar and a white paper that are being put out by OIEG, and that's Oxford International Education Group, for those not familiar. That OIEG has run a series. They're kind of a master agent in the business. They run programs for about half a dozen or so U.S. universities now. Obviously, it's a UK-based organization working with UK universities as well as U.S. institutions, and I think maybe some Australian ones as well. And they're newer to the U.S. market. As I said, they only have about a half dozen partners now. But they are put out this white paper and are doing a webinar, so it's kind of a double whammy. Good timing for them. Makes sense to combine those efforts and obviously have something to talk about. So the webinar is this coming Tuesday next week at 11 a.m. Eastern. That is called A Lack of Diversity Spells Adversity: The Imperative for U.S. Campuses to Diversify Their International Student Population. And it's got some fairly significant players: Ravi Shankar from University of Rochester, Samrat Ray Chaudhary from Webster University, Tanya Creamer from OIEG, and Alex Korda also from OIEG. So the two big players there, Rochester and Webster, on the university side will share their experiences talking about the need for diversity. Now, in terms of why diversity is so important, we see story after story of this happening to institutions, not just in the US, but in Canada, Australia, in the UK as well. Institutions that might not be top tier institutions, but have very significant international populations on the surface. Oftentimes, when you scratch a little bit below and dig a little deeper into their actual numbers, oftentimes they can be heavily dependent on one or two countries. And when I say heavily dependent, I'm talking 50 to 60% or more dependent on students coming from one country. We saw this extensively in Canada, where the public-private partnerships at a lot of the vocational colleges in Canada led to institutions going all in on India and having 70, 80% at some of these private institutions, up to 90% of their students being from India, total students, not just international students, total students. And those are significant, obviously, for a healthy balance. If, for example, there happened to be political upheaval between those two countries, yours and the students from which country you're recruiting most heavily, that can have huge economic consequences. There are private colleges in Canada that have had to close or are under in the past, before the recent caps that were put in place last year on Canadian international students receiving study permits, and again next year, you saw some of these private colleges that were so dependent on students from India having to close. There were some irregularities, some fraud going on in some of these places that all they saw was dollar signs, and that is the risk that a lot of institutions take when they invest, not just in Canada, but this is true in the US, it's true in the UK, it's true in Australia. And again, I'm not talking the well-known schools where this happens, though some have gotten heavily dependent in China in the past. Certainly University of Illinois, it got to the point where they even took out insurance policies to make sure that they were covered in case there was a drop-off in Chinese students attending their institution. So there are countless examples of big, small institutions alike and everywhere in between that have put so many of their international student recruitment eggs in one or two country baskets to allow them to bring in the revenue they need to keep the doors open, to fund new activities, to recruit more international students, whatever the rationale may be. There are so many examples of this that the need for diversifying and relying on more than a couple countries for the bulk of your international students is a priority for U.S. institutions and institutions around the world that are looking to enroll significant numbers of international students. We've always talked about that in the United States. One of the reasons we're not in the financial predicament that a lot of UK universities are facing, that a lot of Canadian colleges and some universities will be facing in the coming year or two, that Australian universities will face, is we aren't as dependent on international students overall in the United States for our higher education enrollment. Right now we're at 5 to 6%. In the UK, Canada, Australia, they're 25, 30, 35% or more as an average for their institutions. They have many fewer institutions. Canada has around 100, UK 150 or so. Canada also has a couple hundred colleges as well, vocational colleges, that can be counted in that mix. And then you have Australia with only 40 universities and then a number of vocational colleges. So there's far fewer to go around for all the international students that they enroll, so their percentages of student populations on those campuses in all three of those other major countries are very significant numbers. So financial implications when you start losing significant numbers from any one country, when you're so dependent on international students for your overall revenue situation, you do get into some very significant financial concerns. There are layoffs coming at a lot of institutions in Canada, UK, Australia. There will be shuttering of departments. There will be downsizing in some respects. So there are some real concerns when you become so heavily dependent on international students in general, but specifically when you become so dependent on one or two countries. And I mentioned that this is not just a Canadian, Australian, UK phenomenon. Have seen recently that international students are running into some major challenges in getting visas from certain countries, and visa approval rates were down significantly in India this year when most colleges had gone all in India in the last couple of years. Some institutions became so heavily dependent that there's a story that was in our newsletter this week where St. Louis University in my home city, St. Louis, Missouri, was expecting over 1,300 new international students this fall, graduate students this fall, and ended up only getting 300. And that 1,300 was based on previous year's enrollments. So to have 1,000 fewer students enroll, and the article didn't specify, but since learned that it's from countries in South Asia, India and Bangladesh, where they enrolled a huge number in the previous year, are expected to enroll that number again, didn't get those enrollments. And as a result, they are short 1,000 international students at the graduate level that pay on average $36,000 per head. So that's a $3.6 million, 3.6 or 36? $36 million budget shortfall that they're now grappling with. I think the article says it's only 20, but if you just calculate out the 1,000 fewer international students they were expecting, that's $36 million in tuition revenue. So that certainly leaves a massive hole, and certainly that institution isn't the only example of that, but that's certainly one that popped up even in the last week. So the reliance, the overall dependence of some institutions on students from one or more countries is a significant challenge. Just to give you a perspective, we certainly don't have the volume that St. Louis University has, but at UNLV in this past intake, we had just under 300 new international students, both undergrad and grad. Those students were spread out across 55 different countries. And the largest single number we had from any one country was 35 from China, 26 from India, 23 from Iran and South Korea, and then 16 from Nigeria and 15 from Vietnam. Those were our top countries. So we had over 10 countries that had double-digit new international students coming to us, none more than 35. So we have our diversity kind of going well at this point at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. So we're not overly dependent on any one country. I think in our population of now well over 1,200 international students from first year undergraduate through to PhD students we have, and those on OPT, we have over 1,200 enrolled. And I think the only country, I think they're the largest single country in that mix is Korea, and we have about 150 or so from Korea. So we are very well diversified in our international population, total of about 93 countries represented in the mix now. So that's where we are at UNLV. Fortunately, we don't have the volume that some of these other larger schools have. We're at over 1,000 international students, but we are certainly on a growth trajectory, and part of that growth is focused on the diversification piece. So there was a PI News article that covered the OIG white paper, and it talks specifically about the U.S. in there, and talks about the reason to become advocates with your government affairs folks at your institutions, to talk about African student visa denials, talking about some of the larger source markets and some of the declines that have happened previously. We've experienced actually an increase from China in the last couple of years, particularly at the grad level, after the drop-off happened with undergraduate Chinese. And we certainly are expecting India to rebound significantly in the next year, particularly for the spring intake. So we are seeing a lot more positive momentum, but the OIG piece, their white paper talks about it, that to help, the reason for diversification is to avoid potential disruption. And that's something we certainly all want at our institutions, is to keep above the high water mark and keep our financially and keep our diversifying the sources of where our students are coming from. So that's our first question of the day. And I'm dropping the links to that webinar for OIG and then the PI News article so that you can have that for your reference. Now, with regard to the other major issues of the day, beyond the diversification piece, we are seeing issues that we've talked about before here on the Roundup, and I guarantee you they're going to become even more important in the weeks and months to come. And that is question number 2. Should U.S. colleges be ranked by outcomes for international students? Now, this is a pretty significant piece here. Why is that important? Because we get so laser focused on rankings on quality, how we're doing on Times Higher Ed, how we're doing on QS, Shanghai rankings, whatever it might be. There's so many rankings out there that and I've never been a big advocate of rankings because I think they're all show ponies for reputation more than anything else. But there are a few that have popped up in recent years. I know Carnegie classifications are changing to also focusing domestically on outcomes, which is great. And now we have a new ranking that our colleagues at F1 Higher are putting out, and that is called the, so you get the official name of this ranking, so you get it right. I just wrote it down somewhere else, and now I'm looking for it in an article and can't find it. But it is Outcomes for International Students, basically, and it takes data from this it takes data from federal sources only, looking at average salary, return on investment based on tuition, and the ratio of international students granted green cards and permanent residency. So this is a ranking that is focused on career outcomes. And it's become increasingly important to do this because since the pandemic, even before the pandemic, we're starting to see signs of it. The number one factor for prospective students in their choice of institutions was what the career outcomes were going to be, what the return on their investment was going to be, what the career services are like at the institutions that they're going to be attending, and having data that they can see and find about each institution that they're considering to see how international students are doing when they graduate. This one is probably the most granular focused ranking on international students that I've seen. Certainly when it comes to the outcomes piece, it's the only one I've seen for specifically international students. And that's something that I think we can't ignore. And I think I'm sharing this data with our undergraduate education folks, with our career services folks, so that they're aware, hey, this ranking exists now. We're not on it. We need to be. So how do we improve what we're doing in terms of the services we're providing to our international students to increase their opportunities for jobs after graduation, and those that choose to stay after OPT, for H-1B and permanent residency, all of that. Are we tracking that? So this is just a way for us to showcase and focus on in our services to international students, and provide the data if we can have it, and if not data, certainly the anecdotal stories of successful international graduates and what they're doing. And that will play well with your future student audiences. So it is a very cyclical thing. We use the successes of our international students, salaries, job, percentage graduates, number on OPT, what they're doing now, and those anecdotal stories to feed back into our recruitment process, because that piece on focusing on demonstrated outcomes for your international students is a priority now. So how can we best do that? And so this survey, hopefully will kickstart some conversations on campus if it hasn't already. There's so much good content in here, and I really hope more institutions prick up their ears to this and make it a priority on their campuses to really focus on identifying where the potential shortcomings are for their services meeting the needs of international students, particularly at that most important end, at the back end of their time on campus before they graduate, making sure they're ready and prepared for what's coming next. So there were a couple articles there, one from the PI, also one from The World that talks about graduating international students seeking work in the U.S. face complicated job search. So it's talking through that process, and that how one of the U.S. campus-based people, immigration people, mentioned, hey, employers need to be educated too, and it's not just career services that is responsible. It's not just international student offices that are responsible, but our universities need to work with their partners, industry partners, to talk through, hey, these international students can legally work in the U.S. from 1 to 3 years after they finish their degree. And if you like them, then you can hire them on a more permanent basis, semi-permanent basis through H-1B. So that's that most organizations, most employers don't get that. And that's the part that's really down to the employers, the universities, to help educate the employers on what exactly is possible. So great set of resources here on that. We keep hearing from industry experts as well that are in the back end of the recruitment process, of the student recruitment process, helping to get the messages out about institutions. They talk about what they're hearing from prospective students and prospective parents about the process. So the articles that I've put into the chat should hopefully give you some better examples of what to expect when institutions are grappling with these kinds of issues. So some really good content there to help extend your reach for the content that you're providing, the data that you're collecting, the markers that you're tracking, the metrics that you're using to identify success for international students on your campus, because that has to be there. It's not just retention rate, it's not just graduation rate, it's employment rates, it's persistence to graduate education if they're starting an undergrad, what their average job salaries are, those that continue on and get permanent residency or first H-1B status. All of that are factors that we need to consider and be able to eventually quantify for future student audiences and their parents, because they matter. That data will matter, and if you have it, you're going to be golden, and if it's good, obviously, in terms of the kind of content that you can share with your prospective student audiences and their parents. So should U.S. colleges be ranked by outcomes internationally for their students and graduates? Absolutely. It'll hold some institutions' feet to the fire and hopefully get the kind of change necessary to make this and put in place the services that really matter and can help improve your institution's standing when it comes to getting your graduates jobs after graduation. And not just any jobs, but good jobs in their field that really elevate them and in the process elevate your institution's reputation, particularly with future student audiences. So that's the second question of the day. The final question is one that has been percolating for a while. And this is a question that it's not just being asked in Australia, it's being asked in Canada, it's being asked in the UK, and in other countries to lesser extents. But what is the damage being done down under, really? In terms of the changes that the government has implemented or has already implemented and is about to implement caps in Australia, that Canada's already done the same. UK's imposed restrictions on students coming with dependents if they're not studying at the PhD level. There are other restrictions. They've increased the minimum salaries for graduates, so that limits the opportunities for international graduates in the UK to get jobs. Canada is also preventing extensions on postgraduate work permission. They're, in addition to the caps that they've already put in place. They're going to be expanding the caps for another year. So there's continual damage going to be done there. In both those cases will cost billions of dollars, pounds, Australian dollars, Canadian dollars, and British pounds in the process. So down under, let's go deep with them today. There are 3 articles I'll share with you, actually maybe even 4. First one from the World University rankings that just came out for the Group of 8. And if you're not familiar with the Group of 8, that's the equivalent of the Ivy League in Australia. They're top 8 institutions, and the most prestigious ones. They have seen drops in their rankings in World University Times Higher Ed rankings. So there are they have now 6 universities, Group of 8 universities, are in the top 100 rankings globally. So there are opportunities that the challenge has been they are dropping. Those research-intensive unities in the Group of 8 are dropping and just barely are hanging on to the top 100. So the rankings have always been seen as a point of pride for Australian universities. The more the institutions they can get in, they obviously have a very limited number of 40 or less. So to get 6 in the top 100, that's a significant one. But when those rankings have been declining for that, of the 38 universities that were ranked in the whole ranking system, 17 declined in performance and only 4 improved their position. So, and the THE rankings highlighted international ed policy as a reason for the decline. So the drop in rankings is affecting Australian universities' prestige. And that's not a good thing when you're trying to build on and grow your international enrollments, which is going to be a struggle for any Australian institution for the foreseeable future, as long as these caps are in place. So what will happen next? So let's talk about the next level down. Is we have issues of another perspective on this from a neighbor in the South Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean, and that's from their cousins in New Zealand. And they have, there's a post there from Scoop in New Zealand that certainly does put out regularly a bit of information on international education in Australia and in the region. And they had made the point, and one of the experts is saying that the cap that Australia is about to put in place runs contrary to what every conceivable government sector person would think would be reasonable, and that's because one of the quotes that I really loved coming out of this is that is from a New Zealand perspective, is that they are basically cutting off one of their largest single export sectors. And the quote is, "Something strange is happening in Australia. The federal government is promoting legislation to reduce one of the country's largest exports, educational services." So that will mean a cap of only 270,000 new international student visas being issued for 2025. And that will bring the number of students coming to Australian universities and vocational educational training institutions to pre-pandemic levels. So that is going to be a significant financial cost to those institutions that are going to be enrolling far fewer students. We're looking at drops. Australian numbers were closing in on 800,000 total, and they're going to be capped for, and that was total in the country. Now they're going to be capped for new students in 2025 at 275,000. So quite significant drop. So that's that report on the cap, and from the New Zealand perspective is very interesting. The next article that we'll talk about reflects kind of what the students, international students currently in Australia, kind of fighting back, and it's good to see that. And you see these international students starting to mobilize and starting to show how valuable they are to the country, and you have that reflected in the rallying cry, "You need us." International students protest recent visa changes, say they fear they may be forced to return home, warning Australians, "You need us." And that's from the Australian, or news.com.au. So certainly that is a message that institutions certainly don't want to hear. The Australian institutions that are enrolling students, hearing that their students might have to return home, that they have now seen the government that welcomed them at one point turn against them, and it's a feeling. And you've seen that in Canada, that when you say cuts, when you see caps, when you see limits put in place, no matter what language you use to pretty it up and justify it, the intended impact of that, or the unintended consequence of that, is that it's reputationally damaging your country as a welcoming place for new international students and immigrants in general. So this migration overhaul that the Albanese government in Australia is undertaking is going to have significant long-term damage. Now, what does that long-term damage mean? There's even a piece in the Australian Financial Review that talks about 5 national security concerns, and that's something for all of us to think about, in the implications of reducing numbers of international students as having national security implications. This article from the Australian Financial Review, and thanks for tuning in, Artie, and you're welcome to the links. And make sure you're subscribed to the newsletter. You get them already on Monday morning. So please check out those links to subscribe. But in terms of the Australians and what they're looking at, this article in the Australian Financial Review talks about how it's been well documented that international education is Australia's biggest export outside of mining and agriculture. So these markets are particularly volatile when China economy is slowing and becoming less mineral dependent. That impacts those other areas. And now education, which could have been and should be an important part of a national security policy, is now being limited. That Instead of being a super growth sector, as recently as 2016, international education was identified in Australia as a super growth sector that had the most potential. The Albanese government is now condemning Australia to, in the quote from this article, to quote unquote, a future dependent on primary commodities exports that are subject to declining global demand. So, and they make 5 reasons that in the article why Australians should be concerned. They talk about caps further weaken the capacity of universities to invest in core research areas that are contributing to dependence on other countries for know-how in critical areas such as energy, infrastructure, and technology. So there are Australia, UK, US commitments that in relation to high technology between the US, UK, and Australia, nuclear powered subs in exchange for contributing to building and maintenance of an expanded nuclear sub fleet. There are also some other implications there. The caps diminish universities' ability to train and attract the world's leading researchers. In effect, will quote unquote reduce Australia's ability to build and service nuclear powered submarines and develop cutting edge defense technologies. Okay. That there's going to be lost talent in this process, impeding universities' capacity to drive technological advancement and increasing dependence on other nations, which we talked about. And that third, caps undermine universities' capacity to build the student alumni groups who act as ambassadors and increase the goodwill and cross-cultural understanding that are key for national security. And certainly that's a view we have in the United States with our State Department's goal of mutual understanding as a main goal, promoting mutual understanding across through educational exchange. And fourth, caps foster an external perception of isolationism and mistrust. So they are damaging Australia's reputation abroad, like I was sharing earlier. And finally, by encouraging a focus in a constrained environment on safe bets in terms of student recruitment, caps limit the capacity of universities to diversify their student base. They increase dependence on 1 or 2 markets. So it comes full circle. We were talking about international diversification at the first question today, and one of the reasons, one of the consequences for Australia capping their international students, it will limit the capacity in Australia for universities to diversify their base. So they'll be increasingly dependent on 1 or 2 markets. So there we go. It's a rule that is becoming the norm. And as we talked about throughout this message today and in other episodes of the Roundup and in the newsletter, that kind of diversification matters because it helps insulate your institution from the swings and roundabouts of global and political upheaval that affect student flows from 1 or more countries. So when you're diversified, you're in a better position to survive longer term. So yes, diversify or die, or suffer the consequences. So there's that's all we have for you this week on the Roundup. Thanks for joining in this week. And if you haven't already voted, if you're in the United States, please do so. If you're going to be out of town or out of the country during Election Day, I know I will be. I voted today at my local, where's my badge? Where's my badge? Yes, I voted in Ohio, yep, at my local county election commission. So please vote. It matters what we do, and it matters that we exercise our civic duty, and we hope all of you have that opportunity to do so where you can.